Let's begin by welcoming to our webinar today on working with simulations, learning by doing, improve student engagement and retention. We are glad to have you all here with us this afternoon. I am your host, Jessica Hayes, and I am an active classroom certified trainer. And our presenter today is Richard D. Giacomo. Richard graduated from San Jose State University with a BA in Ancient and Medieval History, a BA in Social Science, and an MA in American History. He has been a teacher for over 20 years. He has taught in a variety of schools, from private and continuation schools to public high schools. He has taught everything from at-risk and limited English students to honors and college preparatory classes. The subjects he has taught includes U.S. and world history, government, economics, Bible and ethics, history of the Cold War, and contemporary world history. He has been a reviewer and contributor to textbooks and has been a frequent presenter at social studies conferences on the use of simulations, videos, and computers in education. Rich's love for role-playing and strategy games led him to develop his unique books, which combine the open-ended outcomes of role-playing with the tough decisions made by people in times of historical crisis. Students often relate that these are their most memorable and enjoyable activities of the year. They bring history to life so vividly that students cannot seem to stop talking about the simulations long after class is over. Now I am going to turn the session over to Rich.
All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining me. I'm a teacher like most of you too, so that's how I got started in writing simulations. I went to a conference session and they said how to publish your own works, and I thought that's a good idea. So I like to look at what's available and see, what would I like if I were a teacher? And so everything I've written has been tried out in my own classroom, and my students really enjoy them. In fact, they can't stop talking about them. I get complaints from the math teacher. What is this game that you're doing? They won't shut up about it, So, or they're talking about it around the dinner table or something like that. So if you see the poster behind me here, what will students remember in 10 years? A simulation. And I've had students come back literally 10 years later and say, I remember that thing we did in your class where we were doing the revolution and, we had all the parties and everybody had their little sign, that sort of thing. So they really remember it quite well. So I'm going to go ahead and share screen with you guys and show you my my PowerPoint here. There we go. So welcome everyone. So what will your students remember in 10 years? A simulation-based webinar. And that's a little bit of information about me there. Also, one of the things I do in my books is I also put my contact information. So unlike a lot of games, sometimes you go to play a game and you say, I don't understand these rules, I don't know what to do. I have my contact information there. So if you ever get stuck and don't know what to do, I get letters from teachers all the time with suggestions or clarifications or things like that. So I welcome you to contact me if you have any questions. All right, so we're going to go over today what are simulations, the types of simulations, the rationale for why you do simulations, where do you get them, and some examples of simulations. So simulations are when a student assumes a historical persona. So it's a type of role-playing usually. Sometimes they're scripted, sometimes they're not. So the idea is that you're trying to get the student into the shoes of somebody in history so they develop some empathy for what people went through at various times in history. It's not required, but if a student has background in role-playing of any kind with games, that's helpful, or acting, but it's certainly not required that a student do that or a teacher be familiar with that to do that. But it is that sort of spontaneous improvisational acting that makes it kind of fun. So students act and make decisions as their persona would based on the research. So one of the most important things you want to do is make sure that they are acting as that character. Just like if you're an actor on stage, you don't want to get out of character and say something that that character wouldn't say. So in history, it's really important that they stick to the time period and don't start putting a bunch of anachronisms or modernisms in there, things that that person wouldn't say. That's one of the things that you have to step in and help with. So within predetermined confines, students make choices that are either recreate or change history. So sometimes the result of the game is exactly the way it turned out in history. and sometimes there's alternate realities, and they come up with completely different things that could have happened but didn't happen. And so it makes a really interesting discussion to talk about when things come out a little bit differently. By playing the role, students gain understanding of how historical decisions were made and empathy for those involved in historical changes. And that's really important that they do that. So there's several different types of role-playing simulations. There are group making in a time of crisis. That's probably the most common time. You put them, common type, you put them in a situation, there's a revolution about to happen, there's a constitutional convention, there's some kind of crisis, the war is over, what are you going to do now? You know, you're a freed slave, what are you going to do now? Things like that. So things like that, elections, some of them are recreated debates that you can do. And that's a nice creative thinking exercise for students, sometimes if they have to step into a role and play something they don't necessarily believe. Sometimes there's trials that you recreate, dramas based on a particular situation. Sometimes there are actual war games where you take sides and you take each other over and there's playing pieces and things like that. Constitutional conventions, some people do model United Nations or a mock legislature. Sometimes there's trading games where there's objectives and you trade commodities and things like that. Sometimes they're more personal, where a person will be asked to pretend they're a person in history and to write a historical letter or a diary, proposal, a treaty, something like that. And then finally, there's a creative project with historical themes. So they might be doing a Civil War newspaper or a Renaissance newspaper. They might be drawing a cartoon or making a game, doing a play, a film, or a TV show. So why do you want to use these? They are very helpful with multiple intelligences. So different types of students will be involved and use their different skill sets, and those all come to play. I've definitely found situations where I've had students that were not participating the entire school year, but when it got to this simulation, they just lit up, and all of a sudden, wow, this is fun, I'm engaged with this. They are excellent for critical thinking. They really get people to think about multiple perspectives in history, so it's not so one-sided. They are as close as we can get to a real world replication. So obviously we can't go back on our time machine and join the Constitutional Convention, but if we can get them to understand what it was like and how complex it was, that's a good thing. They are a form of cooperative learning, and that's always very important. They take advantage of Piaget's play theory and Bloom's taxonomy for synthesis. So they really help students put it all together and understand what it's all about. Studies have shown that they definitely increase retention and conceptual learning. So this is critical thinking that's way beyond filling out a worksheet or doing map work or something like that. They definitely help increase engagement and retention of conceptual learning. So they will meet your objectives for your unit that you're working on, because the students are going to be much more tied in if they can relate to, oh, now I understand what it feels like to be one of those people, or what they went through, or something like that. So that helps with increased rigor and better learning outcomes. Their studies have shown they make much better consistent engagement throughout the activity. So the students stay engaged with what they're doing, and they've even demonstrated better test scores because of their comprehension of your objectives that go on because of the simulations. They increase the interest and understanding in courses, and support active learning strategies that IB schools use. All right, so this is where you can get them. This is the ones that I have done. I have role-playing titles for high school, middle school, some of them for U.S. history, some for world, and some for ELL students. And a few of them are in my creative geography book as well. So most of these are covered by Interact simulations that are a part of Social Studies School Service. All right, so words of caution. Expect some confusion. That's okay. Now, some teachers this is a little out of their comfort zone. I don't like to do simulations. What if the principal walks in and all this chaos is going on? I've never had a principal not like these. In fact, I always scheduled them on the days that I was being evaluated, because I wanted them to see that I was doing something innovative and creative. A little noise and confusion is okay. that means they're having fun and they're learning. You know, they're talking, but they're talking in a good way. Also, keep in mind that these simulations are just simulations. They can never be completely real. We can't go back in history or whatever. But they're the closest thing that we can get to getting students to live through the experience themselves and walk in somebody else's shoes for a while. Sometimes you'll need to review and modify the simulations before implementing them. If you have, for example, ELL students or gifted and talented or other groups that you need to think about, you might modify the simulation. So I encourage you to write to me if you have questions on how to do that on any of the simulations. That is definitely a possibility. I've used other people's simulations where I used only a little part of it, or I changed it, modified it. That's perfectly okay. It's very important that you do the debriefings with the simulations with students. This is where you get into the, how did your game compare to what happened in history, or how does this compare to other revolutions or things like that? So that's where you get some of the really good critical thinking that goes on when the students are talking about what they learned afterwards. So I'd say if you have to cut the simulation a little bit short because of time constraints, that's okay, but never eliminate the debriefing questions, because those are really important. All right, so what's the difference? A role-playing simulation is when students attempt to put, role-playing simulations attempt to put the student in the position of a person in a particular time and place. So all of the simulations involve group problem solving and conflict resolution. So if there isn't any conflict, it's just like writing fiction is not a very good story, right? So there should be some, whenever you write a simulation, should be revolved around some sort of conflict in groups. It's usually centered around a time of crisis or decision making. So there's two major types. They're scripted and unscripted, and they have advantages and disadvantages both ways. So a scripted simulation, the students are given a script to read. So there's a preset script. You are this person, you know, you're in the Constitutional Convention, this is what they did, and you give as much information as possible ahead of time, and what they're to say and do is already scripted out in detail. The unscripted ones are more like improvisational acting. Students play a part by improvisation based on general historical guidelines for a character provided by the simulation. You're a coal miner. Your coal company is going to cut your pay. Are you going to go on strike, or what are you going to do? So it's more open-ended. You give them enough information to know who they are and what role they're playing, but you don't tell them what to do. And even if they come up to you and say, should we go on strike? You say, I don't know. What do you think we should do? So you never actually tell anybody what to do. So advantages of the scripted role-playing simulations is they're generally well researched and well written. They're pretty well detailed, and Interact has a lot of them. The students don't need to have a whole lot of prior knowledge because it's all put there in the book for them, and the script tells them what to do. The disadvantages is they're usually a little bit more costly than books like mine that have a set of simulations together, because they're longer. They take up a lot of class time. So some of these can be 2-3 days. Some of them can be a week. So you have to really say, do I have enough time to devote, for one simulation for that amount of time? Sometimes they're not quite as fun to play because the students have to stick to the role. They're confined to a role that may or may not interest them. The advantages of unscripted simulations. There's no preset limits that are placed on a particular person's choices, as long as they are within the realm of what was historically possible. So sometimes you got to step in and say, no, wait a minute, did really people know about that back then? Or would they have really said it that way back then? Or, you have them doing something that didn't exist, it wasn't invented yet. So maybe so you have to kind of play the God character if you're the teacher running the simulation, and step in sometimes and go, well, no, I'm sorry, can't do that. You can be sort of a judge. The outcome is very unpredictable. So no two classes finish the simulation in the exact same way. So that's pretty interesting. You might run the French Revolution simulation 5 different times and a different party wins each time, or maybe nobody wins. This leads to some very interesting classroom discussions about why things turned out the way they did, what could have happened differently, and how the simulation compares to what actually occurred in history. Disadvantages is the teacher may need to provide some historical context for the simulation if students do not have prior knowledge. So you got to step in and your students, so you can say ahead of time, this is going to work with them, it's not going to work. I try to stay in the simulations ahead of time This is a good one to use at the beginning or an end of the unit or in the middle. Some of them are definitely better done when they don't know anything about the subject and it's completely open-ended, and others are better as culminating activities. So I try to tell you that. And by the way, I also put in the simulations what the complexity level is, so you can make decisions about which group of students this will fit. Some are easy and some are hard. Some teachers are uncomfortable with not using a structured lesson, but I would encourage you to get out of your comfort zone and try something different. There's always a lot of good learning that goes on, even if you're a little uncomfortable and you're not the stage on the stage for the moment. The teacher must actively monitor the activity to ensure that students are on task and meeting objectives. That's one of the harder parts. This is not for the teacher who puts their feet up on the desk and reads the paper while everybody is doing their thing. You got to get up on your feet, walk around to each group. Do you understand what's going on? Do you understand who you're representing? Do you know what you're supposed to do? Here's your time limit. You've got to really keep things moving to keep it interesting. You don't want them to drag out. The teacher must actively monitor the activity to make sure the students are on task and meeting objectives, right? So this one of the most common questions I get is, when do I stop the simulation? And that's really your role as a teacher to decide. So you have to say, okay, when have they met the objectives, right? So if the game is kind of getting dragged down and it's a stalemate or just keeps repeating the same cycles over and over again, I stop it there. It's like if they met the objectives, that's good enough. Sometimes you'll need to carry it on to an extra day or whatever, but I've rarely seen one go more than 2 days or 3 days, something like that. So just kind of use your best judgment at when is it time to call it. So classes doing the simulation might end at different times. So you might have a very abrupt end to the resolution and one party wins and that's it. And then the next period, it takes them another period. So you kind of have to be a little bit flexible with the planning to go for that. All right, so when you want to choose a simulation, you've got to think about the time. So really, simulations, the reason why I started writing them in the first place, my colleagues saw me do them and they said, this is great. You got to share this with other teachers, right? But I started writing them to try to do those really difficult lessons that they just weren't getting through traditional methods. If it was a lecture or film or whatever, and they just didn't get it, they didn't understand it, I found it was much better to have them act it out in a simulation. So you have to decide. Some of these can be done in 5 minutes. Some of them can take a week. So you have to decide, how much time do I have, and is this the best thing? There are some things that don't necessarily lend themselves to simulation. You might have heard recently there's a little bit of controversy about some simulations. About the hard history, right? You don't want to make a student act out something that's going to make them uncomfortable, something that's a sensitive topic. So, tend to stay away from really controversial things like slavery and Holocaust and very traumatic things. The last thing you want to do is to have a student that's upset by what you're doing or put them in an uncomfortable role. Those are generally not good topics for simulations. So you have to say, is the time that I'm going to put into this worthwhile to meet my learning objectives? So that's the most important thing. If it's not meeting your learning objectives, it's not worthwhile. So think about the simulation. Is this the best way to do it? Will another activity meet the objectives better? What other activities will I be giving up to do this lesson? You have to budget your whole unit and see where the simulation fits in. So you don't necessarily want to do like every simulation in each one of my books. You'd run out of time. But I recommend at least doing one per semester at the very least. They're really interesting. So where does it fit my schedule? If you've got an extended schedule, like a block schedule or something, that's a perfect time to do it because the simulation can be done in one setting and you're done. I make them easy to keep records. So I know some simulations have really complicated rules and sheets and pieces and all this money and things to keep track of. I try to keep mine really simple because I know what a hassle it is when you're teaching multiple subjects. Then you're going to run out of time. Okay, wait, where am I put all the pieces for this period? How am I going to find them tomorrow? And who had the money and who's winning? You don't want to deal with all that. You want to keep it simple. So you got to be able to keep records. And then of course, the most important thing is it has to keep their interest or they're not really learning. So if it goes on too long, time to move on to something else. You also have to look at the costs. So some are more cost effective than others. If you get them where they're bundled together, several in one book, that's much more cost effective. And then you can find funding sources for these. I purchased a lot of mine through grants and things that I wrote. And Some of them have different distribution rights. So some is per school, some it's per person, things like that. And then some of them take more work than others as far as reproducing the pieces and rules and things ahead of time. So the nice thing about all of mine is they come with a CD, so you can print out all of the stuff that you need to ahead of time. It's a lot easier than copying it out of the book. And then the pieces, I usually just keep like packets of pieces for each game and have those ready to go ahead of time. All right, so you also need to think about your students' needs and abilities, what grade level, make sure it's fitting that, and the reading level of the students. You need to keep in mind how many ELL students that you have. If you have ELL students, you might want to modify the simulation. There might be things that were written to be individual, but they could be turned into groups. You might script some of it for them ahead of time to make it easier for them that way. You might want to model yourself how it's done first, something like that. But I've used many of these with my, these called ESL back in those days when I was teaching it. And they did just fine. They handled even some of the more complex ones, and they really loved it and did really well. So think about how you're going to form your groups. Do you want to assign groups or have students signed up? You don't want to have students all within their own little friend group. That is not necessarily a good idea. And you do have to watch, because sometimes students will try to cheat and steal pieces and things like that. So you have to keep these things in mind. They get a little too competitive sometimes. What is their prior knowledge of history? So where does this fit in your unit, beginning, middle, or end? And how much simulations have they done? If they've never done simulations before, it might be a little rough the first time getting them warmed up and used to it. But then by the second one, they'll know how it works. And as you go on through the year, they get really comfortable with it. And they'll say, when's the next one? I can't wait. This is really fun. And then think about what kind of assessment. Some of the simulations I recommend different types of assessment. Some teachers like to follow them up with an essay or a class discussion or something like that. All right, so think about how the complexity level of the simulation, and does this fit my students? If so, great. If not, I need to modify it. How much time do you have to run it? If you can get some help with it, it's great. If you're doing team teaching, or you've got a teacher's aide, or maybe some students that can help you with keeping track of the money or the score sheets or something like that, that's great. The length of the rule book. And then you can always adapt them and change them if you need to. And then I always provide a lot of publisher support from my rules if you ever have questions on what to do. And then also how many pieces are there to clean up and store. So in conclusion, simulations can serve as a means to foster interest and inquiry into the social studies. Students should research, think flexibly, and analyze multiple perspectives. That's really what they're going to learn. They're going to learn to think in somebody else's shoes. It's really fun because they become the decision makers. They are totally in control of the outcome of this. It's like a director put the actors on the play and said, go, where do you want to go with this? And they come up with some really interesting and original things. I never thought about that, but yes, of course, you could try that. And also the importance of student debriefing and evaluation. So those are things to think about when you're doing your simulations. So there's a brand new title coming up. It'll be out in just a couple of months. This is part of my series called Role-Playing Simulations. This is for a high school world history class, and it's going to be all about world revolutions. So there's one in there, American Revolution, Patriots versus Tories, exporting the French Revolution, revolutions of 1848. That's kind of like a little drama scripted one. The Italian unification movement called Risorgimento. There's a really fun one where they do propaganda posters saying whether Pancho Villa is a hero or a villain. There's a great one about the Russian Revolution where they have to take over all the assets to take control. There's one about women's suffragettes publicity. If you've seen a TV show, To Tell the Truth, there's one for Gandhi. And there's some more recent history ones like the fall of the Soviet Union, and you get into Gorbachev's critics and advocates. And then there's general debates that fit many different revolutions. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. Thank you for attending. Anybody have any questions? These are the references that'll be in the recording if you want to check them out later.
We do have a few questions.
All right, thanks.
So the first one is Monica asked if you will send them the PowerPoint so they can go back and refer to it.
Sure, I can do that. I have sent that into Social Studies School Service, so we can share that with people.
Okay. And probably if they leave their email, you probably just email it to them as well.
Okay.
Brandon asked if the books come with a translated version.
Translated into other languages?
Yes, I believe so.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. They're only in English at the moment.
Okay. Jordan asked, where can we purchase copies of your role-playing simulations book, or are they all on Active Classroom?
They're at Social Studies School Services, which is socialstudies.com. And the parts of them are also in Active Classroom. So they're sampled as they fit the curriculum. They're in there too. And they're available in print, which has the CD-ROM in it, and they're also available as an ebook.
And then the final one is the series title in Active Classroom called Interact Simulations or Role-Playing Simulations? So, but Interact and role-playing are two separate, correct?
Yeah, so these are, this is what most of them look like. So it'll say U.S. History, high school or middle school or whatever. So this is the role-playing series here. And then some of the ones that are ELL have other activities, but there's also some role-playing simulations in there as well. These are kind of a mixture of grammar and history together, so they're kind of helpful for your ELL students. So, and then there's several other Interact titles that are by other authors as well. Some of the shorter ones are called activators, and then there's longer ones for specific historical events. You know how many there are altogether, Jessica? I'm not sure, but there's a lot.
Yeah, there's a lot. I'm not really sure how many, but there are a lot in Active Classroom.
And even just the Interact books, I know there's got to be at least 50 of them.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So does anybody have any other questions?
You can feel free to unmute yourself if you want to do it that way too now.
All right. While we're waiting, I'm going to go ahead and thank you, Rich, for presenting to us this evening. You have given us a lot of great information about simulations and a lot of good ideas that they can take into their classrooms.
Thank you. Yeah, and I would encourage you to try to write some of your own too. I've seen some really interesting ones that other authors have done too, or if you have an idea for one, feel free to contact me. I'd love to help you out.
So we do have another question. Jordan says that we will be moving to a block schedule next year. Do you suggest using these weekly or once a month?
Yeah, I'd say like once a month, depending on the subject area. They're perfect for a block schedule because you can usually knock the whole game out in one session. So that's really nice. And it'll keep them engaged the whole period. You'd be surprised. Depends on your subject area, but usually most of the books have 10 to 12 simulations. So if you're doing about one a month, that's probably about right.
All right. Any other questions? We're getting a lot of good comments.
Yeah, that's great.
Mm-hmm.
I've done these with students that literally did no other assignment all year. But when we did the simulation, they perked up and went, "This is fun. I want to do more." And I've had kids like stopping me at the door saying, "When's the next one? When's the next one?" So that's good stuff.
Paul asked, would you recommend any for middle school U.S. history students?
Yeah, there's one in, let's see. There's this one here. It's called Role-Playing U.S. History Middle School. So that one, there's some in there. And there's also some in the ELL U.S. History Middle School book. A lot of fun. If you have any questions about any particular era, is there a simulation for this or that? Like this one has a great one in the California Gold Rush where they have to have a family meeting. Who's going to go? Who's going to stay? You know, what do we do about the farm while you're gone? What if you don't find any gold? It's a lot of fun.
Is there anyone in that book that's your favorite?
I like that one. There's also one from the colonial times where they have to make their own colonial charter. So they have to think about all the different things like who gets the land and who does, you know, who pays taxes. Are we going to have indentured servants? Are we going to, you know, what are we going to do about the Native Americans and all these different things like that? There's one where they play out the War of 1812 and the game is designed so that literally nobody wins, which is what happened. So that's kind of fun. All sorts of things like that. I'd say probably overall, the ones that I get the most good feedback on from teachers is the French Revolution simulation. They really like that one. And the World War I simulation, because they're buying colonies and they're buying industries and they're making secret treaties and all of that. So the kids really get the idea of secret alliances in World War I.
All right. Any other questions? What do you suggest for middle school Texas history? And that's from Monica.
There is one. I have one about the Mexican-American War, and there's the war is about to break out, and each person has to decide what are they going to do, which side are they going to be on, and it includes all the different groups. It, you know, it isn't just the people in the Alamo or something like that. It's everybody that was involved in that war. So that's a good one for Texas. There's also I have a secession simulation where the Civil War is about to break out and each state has to decide one by one, and it has sort of the pros and cons for each state, and they have to decide whether they're going to do that or not. Yeah, I can imagine Texas history is a challenging one. I'd say that's a good one. Then also you might want to do the Pancho Villa simulation, since that was pretty close to the border too. He actually came over across the American border on a raid. Any other questions?
All right. Doesn't appear to be any other questions.
All right.
All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead, and this concludes our webinar this evening. Thank you all so much for joining us. If there's no more questions, you please fill out this evaluation link that I have pasted into the chat box. It'll just take you just a few moments. Once you have completed it, you are free to leave. And thank you all so much again for joining us.
All right. Thank you very, very much, everybody.
Thank you again so much, Rich.
All right. I'll go ahead and put my email in the chat box there in case anybody has a question about a game. They can